Okay, it's now time for our final panel session for the day. Once again, you'll be able to ask questions. I'll get them right here on my phone, and we'll be opening the floor as well in a moment. Now, I think it's fairly well documented that disadvantaged communities continue to bear the brunt of the effects of climate change, of global warming, while having contributed the least. So what role can direct air capture and CDR play in benefiting these communities? We're going to have a deep dive now on the role of environmental justice, and for that I would like to welcome to the stage Ugbaad Kosar from Carbon 180, Simone Stewart from the National Wildlife Federation, and Nikki Batchelor from XPRIZE Carbon Removal. Hi. Welcome, come in, sit down. So I think I've gone some way in trying to explain what environmental justice is, or certainly highlighting the challenge that we're facing. So maybe I can speak to you all as to what is environmental justice? What are we talking about here today? Nikki, maybe I can start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Nice to be up here today. And I just maybe might take a small step back and think about the conversation really around what is responsible deployment. And I would say, environmental justice is a key component of that, but also it's important to think about, what are environmental impacts and harms and risks of these projects? What does it look like to have equitable and just deployment in the communities that we're going to? What does it look like to start engaging communities and recognizing that there are past harms that have occurred, and especially in a lot of the frontline communities. And I think that having a holistic perspective on the topic is important, but I'll let my colleagues join in
Sure.
here.
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in. I know that environmental justice has come up a lot more in recent years, especially in the carbon removal conversation, but it's actually a really long-standing both social movement and a field of study. So there's a lot of scholarship that's out there. There are a lot of experts that specialize in this work, and there's a broad umbrella, especially in the context of the US, which is the context in which we're speaking of a history of it being rooted in civil rights, in occupational health and safety, in labor movements, indigenous sovereignty and protections. And ultimately what it's trying to do is address the history of environmental racism in the US. This can be applied to a lot of other conversations, but this is really where the root of the movement came from and where it was based in. There's no single legal definition for what environmental justice is, but there are a lot of sort of common themes like healthy living environments, protections for all, access to clean air, access to open space. All of these sort of thematic pieces fall under the broader definition of EJ. And that's a little bit different than climate justice, although there's a lot of shared ideas and principles.
What would the difference be?
Yeah, so climate justice is actually looking at the climate change, or looking at climate change through a human rights lens. So acknowledging the fact that climate change is going to impact different people in different ways. And specifically, it's going to impact those that are least responsible the most. So we're looking at, from a global context, global south countries, places in where my family's from, in Somalia, and I know we were just having a conversation about Kenya, places in Asia, whereas environmental justice is more of like a place-based, sort of looking at local conditions, looking at local impacts like air quality, like water quality. So there's a lot of shared themes, but these terms are not necessarily interchangeable.
I think it's really interesting that you've explained to me the current situation, but Nikki, you brought up this great phrase, which is responsibility. Who is responsible for this? I mean, we're at a direct air capture summit. Is this our responsibility? Surely this is the kind of responsibility that lies with governments. Simone.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, everyone. I think that the responsibility question is one that people are really interested in getting an answer to, because communities feel as though they have borne the brunt of, harmful industries for a very long time, whether it is, heavy industry or we're talking about oil and gas. And so I think when we talk about responsibility, that's something I frequently hear in the CDR sector or in the DAC sector is we weren't responsible for the previous harms, so how come it is now integrated into our workflow, our strategy, that we have to care about environmental justice. And I think that one of the things that I always like to point out when we have conversations with communities or community development groups or individuals, oftentimes people in the sector are talking about their concerns. So whether it's applying for DOE hub applications or even in conversations between developers, we're saying a community is concerned about this, they're concerned about that. But what I think that we don't ask communities enough is, what is your vision for your future? And how does direct air capture, how does CDR play into that vision? And I think that when we think holistically, like Nikki was saying, about the role CDR plays in creating a healthy and sustainable society, then to me it becomes obvious answering and addressing this question is a part of the work that we have to do in order to move forward to that future that we can co-create with communities.
Nikki and Ugbaad, you actually just co-published a report on some of the challenges that we're facing when it comes to environmental justice. Nikki, maybe you can explain a little bit more about what you found.
Yeah, so just for context, we published this report a couple of months back, and it was really to focus on this topic from the lens of the XPRIZE carbon removal, which I manage, and we were trying to start to gather data around how all of the carbon removal startups are thinking about this topic. So there was a component to the milestone round submission that we did last year that was a questionnaire of like, how are you thinking about all of these different environmental justice topics? We kind of collated that data and did some analysis around how people are looking at it, and then worked with Carbon 180 and a team of EJ experts and practitioners to then like craft recommendations based on that for the companies themselves. So one of the biggest things that we saw is that many people still immediately equate environmental justice with job creation. That is like the first thing that people think of. It was the most frequently cited reference in all of the answers. And so that's something, you know, that we've been talking a lot about is, yes, that's important, but that is a very narrow view of what environmental justice is and should be thought of at a company. And so trying to then broaden the thinking to include like understanding what the communities have experienced in the past, starting to think about like what it might look like to go do engagement. I'll let Ugbaad to speak more about some of the recommendations that we came out from. But the report itself is both meant to be, you know, a reporting of like the state of the companies and how people are thinking about it right now, but also something to move us forward because we really need more resources on the topic.
How often are companies even thinking about this?
Pretty often, actually. I think it's definitely a growing conversation, and I think more and more companies are starting to understand not only is it maybe there's a moral imperative where you want to do the right thing and you believe in that, it's important that everyone is involved and everyone is protected, but there's also a business case for this as well of it builds resiliency into your business. It helps with really good deployment. It makes sure that you're not hitting those road bumps that come when you are doing deployment that hasn't been thoughtful or doing deployment that hasn't had community buy-in. I know social acceptability has come up, public license has come up. All of these terms and all these ideas are tied back into the principles of what environmental justice is, which is making sure that projects happen where they are wanted and in a way that they are wanted. So these are really important pieces. And just tying back to what Nikki said about the report, one of the things that what we recognize is people want to do this work. Developers, early startups, large-scale commercial, I mean, the entire span, but they just don't know how to get started. And I think that's where a lot of the work is how do you do community engagement really well? How do you know where to reach out to and how to have that conversation? And I think that's where the crux of the recommendations that we're trying to get at is, which is not only doing it to do it, but to do it well.
Okay, so I'm guessing that one of your recommendations is this engagement with your communities. What do you mean by that?
Yes.
Give some ideas into some steps for companies that are watching.
Yes, so community engagement is not just getting a community to agree to the project that you're trying to do, and I think that's a really important piece to underline. Community engagement is a two-way learning and conversation. It's you as a project developer having an idea or some sort of project that you want to deploy or you want to explore, and you're looking into where can I do it and how should I do it. Now the community engagement piece, the two-way piece comes in when you are not only answering questions, but you are also receiving questions and you are asking them as well. I think the other piece that's really important is when you go into a town hall or maybe DOE is hosting a session, whatever it may be, you are actively listening with the idea to input the feedback you get back into your business plan or your deployment. It should also come out with some sort of characteristics that are going to change from your project based on what you're hearing. So whether it's specific pieces of the project you're doing, whether it's thinking about other co-benefits that can come from your project and being really creative about that, or ultimately, in some cases, maybe rethinking the location that you're going to be deploying altogether because it's just not wanted. So I think that two-way piece is really important, and making sure that it's really transparent and accessible as well.
And I mean, I think, especially from a startup perspective, and please, I just want to play devil's advocate for a second, but you know, surely this kind of engagement with a community is just a nice to have. I'm guessing it's not, but Nikki, Simone.
Yeah, no, I think that you know, it is nice to have, like Ugbaad said, like there is a moral component in it, that we should care about others, and that we are doing the work we're doing because we care about the climate, and the climate is all something that we share as a planet. So there is an idea that it is just good to do, but I also think that it's more than just good, but it's responsible. I think building community engagement, building environmental justice into the strategies and plans that you're creating should just be a part of any type of project that you do. Any type of project, even when you were in school, you know, you made room for feedback. Your teachers would write little notes on your essays to let you know what they thought. Hopefully you would take that feedback from them, and then you would incorporate that into the next paper and get a better grade on it. It's not something that I think most of us are unfamiliar with, but I think that for a very long time, large industries have been able to operate without having to consider the communities that they've operated in. And I think that that's what's put us in this you know, situation in the first place, that communities haven't been considered. And I think that oftentimes communities have ideas. They are, you know, if you can get people in the room, people are eager to talk about their perspectives and share. And I think people feel more comfortable doing that with people that they trust and people that they know are going to incorporate that feedback in order to steer the project in a direction that is not just good for the project developers, but that they know is going to be good for their community. I have a mechanical engineering background and migrated into policy from that. But one of the things that, you know, I talk about and I always say is, I am an expert in mechanical engineering. I'm an expert in policy. I am not an expert in a community's lived experience. People that have lived in those communities, oftentimes for generations, that have familial ties back to them, that have really, really solid culture built in these places, are experts in that culture. And so in order to have a conversation with people, just as you would hope, the people in this room, would hope that people would respect your expertise. You know, I don't want to be told how to be an engineer because I know how to be an engineer. You should come with that same respect to communities, to respect their knowledge of their community. They know what's going to work best. They know what hasn't worked in the past. So I think not trying to put one you know, expertise above another, but really trying to marry the two of them is what's most important.
Do you have any?
I was just going to say, I'll just add two other kind of layers for the consideration. I agree with everything you said, but I mean, there are other lenses to look at this from a business perspective. If you're thinking about, you know, the potential risks of your project being cited in a community that is not supportive of where you're going. So there's kind of a social license to operate element here that people can justify their work on the topic from a business perspective. And then also, I think just broadly as a community right now, we're building something new that is very unknown and unfamiliar to a lot of people. And there are a lot of iterations of what it might look like beyond just direct air capture. We're talking about enhanced weathering and ocean solutions and things that, you know, have public perception risks. And so the first handful of demonstrations that really get built and talked about out in the world will have a large impact on how this community can scale, how we can really, you know, build more projects, and all of that is critical to addressing the climate challenge, as we've been talking about all day. So thinking about this as part of your, you know, commitment to the ecosystem as well, to have projects go smoothly and be supported by and, you know, desired by the communities that you're trying to go and work in is important. And thinking about the other side of that and the benefits that you're bringing with those projects is key.
Yeah. Is this something that we can learn from other industries? We've talked about that already as well today, but is this community engagement, is this environmental justice something that we can learn from other industries, and if so, how? Ugbaad, perhaps.
Sure, I'm happy to start. Absolutely. I think that's the only real resource that we have right now is looking at similar or similar-like industries. So whether it's thinking about what happened in the renewable space, deployment in some places went really well because there was great community engagement at the outset. There was buy-in, there was co-creation. I mean, there's even small-scale like community solar that has really sort of reinvigorated the idea of understanding technology is not the enemy, it's the way in which it's going to be implemented that really makes or breaks it. There's, with the renewables piece, I mean, jobs is something that comes up all of the time when you hear an environmental justice benefit. And with the renewable energy sector, I mean, sometimes those jobs didn't necessarily come to fruition, and that actually caused blowback to the solar industry and trust from a lot of the developers with the communities in which they wanted to deploy. And so if you're going to think about the benefits, being really realistic and saying these are the ones that we absolutely know we can bring, and here are the ones that we need to honestly have a discussion about of whether or not it can come to fruition, that's a really big lesson I think that we need to take away from other industry.
I think also, maybe learning from what industries have done and learning from what industries haven't done. Oftentimes, a lot of people's skepticism in these communities is because of oil and gas and heavy industry. And so looking back, it's really important, I think Nikki said it, that we really understand the history of what has happened in a particular community. I think it's very difficult to create a path forward for a community without understanding how they got to the place that they're at. And so doing the research on the community, talking to people about the experiences that they've had, I think really should shape the way that that engagement looks going forward. When you know that someone has been harmed in a really specific way and previously, you're going to do everything in your power to not repeat that. So I think, also taking examples and lessons from specific things that have happened in renewables, but also looking at, other aspects of the energy industry from the past and thinking about how we can move forward with that information now that we know it.
Nikki, maybe you can explain a little bit more about how these relationships have been developing, some of the good points and some of the challenges that we're facing in connecting with the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key piece of this conversation is recognizing that the projects are hyper-localized. And so the communities are not one size fits all. It's a completely different set of considerations, experiences, locations, geographies, demographic makeups. And so, when a lot of this perspective too is US driven with a lot of the environmental justice movement, but now we're talking about a global industry and deploying projects all over the world and companies crossing borders, maybe you started in the US, but you're deploying in Kenya or wherever it may be. And so recognizing, that lens that you're bringing might be completely different to the context that you're going to. So the key piece of doing community engagement from the outset is really understanding what those considerations need to be and what the needs are of that community, what their experiences are that they're bringing to the table. Because maybe you're, in a rural fishing village and they know nothing about DAC. They don't maybe need to if you're working on an ocean solution, and they might not have any, predisposition to oppose it. They might love it. So, there's, I think, a range of experiences, and representing like hundreds of startups, I'm seeing that everybody has a different reaction to this topic. And by saying, we want you to think about this from day one, for some it's really easy, and for others it's a lot harder because of kind of the communities you're going into, or the technology or solution you're bringing to the table brings its own kind of risks potentially with it.
Yes, please.
Can I hop in that? I think something else that maybe is taken for granted is that you are understanding what the community is asking or saying, and they're understanding you. I think the carbon removal field has a bit of a communications issue, to put lightly, where there's not necessarily shared language across the board, and there's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of verbiage, there's a lot of jargon. There's peeling back that language and having a really shared understanding of what it is you're actually talking about. Like, this is what direct air capture is or isn't, and it is not point source CCS for these reasons, but there's these similarities in these instances. I mean, having that type of conversation will take you very far, because when I engage with a lot of environmental justice organizations or local advocates, half the time we're just making sure we're talking about the same thing before we can actually dig into the details and really understand where the risk or the the pushback is actually coming from.
I mean, this is something that I wanted to bring up as part of our conversation anyway, because I know that you three work on educational projects specifically to kind of cut through that jargon. But maybe if I can circle back to that at the end, because before I do that, I want to understand, sure, we engage with communities so that we can have better relationships with them, but how does environmental justice and how does all of this that we're talking about, how does this help scale the business, the industry that we're ultimately in? Does it have that feedback loop?
I think that Nikki kind of touched on it, that, it's about, we talk about social license to operate, but I think that it's very evident that one drop can poison the well. And it's very difficult to move forward when there is a bunch of negative press around a particular project. As Ugbaad just said, there's a lot of times and circumstances where we're really just pointing out the differences between what CDR is versus CCS. And now if there's issues within CCS, to once again take another step of nuance to say, well, this project isn't that project, and that's how they're different, I think it's really difficult. It's sometimes maybe frustrating as people who are working in this field or advocates of this field, because you truly do believe in the technology and what you think the technology can bring to a community. But oftentimes communities don't necessarily have the bandwidth to handle all of the nuance that goes into the conversation. And I think that is a ramification of, especially in America, what we're experiencing and historically these communities have experienced. And so I think it's not just about getting communities on board, but once again, kind of getting community feedback to understand how we can become better engineers, better developers. And I think that sourcing that information, crowdsourcing that feedback, allows us to become more inclusive of the entire process. Because when I think about the future that I want, I think about the net zero, zero carbon future. I want it to be a future that everyone participates in. Because for far too long, we have had only certain people making decisions, certain demographics of people, certain types of people in certain industries. And well, we understand that's where we are right now. So I would really like, if we're going to improve and make things better, I think it's integral to bring everyone into the conversation to make it really inclusive.
Okay, so what are some of your recommendations then, Nikki?
I mean, I'll add another kind of layer onto that question that you were just addressing too. I mean, if you just think practically about like the footprint of what it looks like in the technology like scale up journey here. If we can't convince a community that it's a good idea with the smallest size plant that could be beneficial, that people could wrap their minds around, how are we going to get to that support at a scaled up version? So I do think it is critical to be thinking about it now, because if we're off to the wrong start now, it's going to be very difficult to catch up if the support really goes awry, and that builds momentum. So I think that that's really important. The recommendations piece, I mean, we've talked about a couple already. I think I would add into the mix like this concept of a trusted messenger. We've talked about how important it is to kind of understand the perspective and experience and expertise of the community. It can also be powerful to bring on representatives of that community, either directly or advisors, or as a kind of a liaison between the company and what they're trying to do and the community, because they have all those relationships. They understand how to speak both sides. So I would say that that can be a powerful vehicle to explore if it's something that your company has the ability to do it. We've been like on the side trying to encourage other funders to continue supporting this work, and I think ideas have been thrown out around like maybe fellowship programs where people can be trained on like how to go into different areas, or maybe even you could like apply and get some funding to have someone from your local community come onto your team for a period of time. I think there's a lot of really cool ideas that could be explored here, and now that there's definitely interest and growing demand and trying to figure out how to do this, not just that it matters, but like, how do I get started? Give me a roadmap of 10 steps. I think that's what I'm hearing from companies who we're asking to. They're thirsty for that, so there's an opportunity for more resources to be put out.
I think also, bringing it back to DAC specifically, 'cause that's what we're talking about here, there's a lot of work to be done in being creative about the co-benefits that can come with direct air capture. So yes, there's the very obvious carbon removal, permanent sequestration potential, and the broader climate good that will bring. And then there's the idea of jobs that keeps coming up that we can talk about. But being creative about what other benefits, if they do exist, and if not, how can we be forward and upfront about that? I raise that because what I hear all of the time in the work that I do is we want trees and we want soils and we trust this and we're familiar with it and it's safe and it brings us clean air and clean water and it brings us access to open space and just all of these things that and these benefits that make their day-to-day lives better and addresses the immediate concerns that they have here and now today, which is access to all of these things. So when we think about direct air capture, we need to also be starting to think about how does this intersect with that? And if it doesn't, we need to have a conversation about that as well.
I think that Ugbaad really makes a good point in that oftentimes I tell people in the industry, we have to get creative about this. I think that oftentimes the technological development, everybody says, well, it's good for climate, so it's good for that community, so the community should get on board with it. And I think that's kind of a narrow perspective because what people really want in their daily lives is for their needs to be addressed. And oftentimes what we've seen come out of the environmental justice movement as a branch of the civil rights movement was that people's needs, people's humanity was not being addressed. And that's what's continued, that's what's been added on to by previously toxic industries in these communities. And so I think it's okay to think outside of a very kind of like linear capitalist perspective of like, I need to develop this project and I need to make money off of this project. But I think that, thinking a little bit abstractly is as to what the benefits really can be and how the benefits are linked to not only people's daily lives, but changing the systems that we live in that create the problems that people are experiencing in their daily lives. Oftentimes, these disadvantaged communities are very disenfranchised. And if you talk to me, you've probably heard the example before that one day I was getting a car share, and I was on the app getting ready to order the car, and all of the images of the car had a little American flag on the app. And I was like, I wonder what this is. And it was actually a promotion that the car share operator worked with local communities to offer discounted rides if the person was going to a polling place that would allow them to vote. And so that was able to increase access in disenfranchised communities where maybe people would ride share or share with other people. The two of us, we could split a ride share to go vote. And that was something that was empowering for the community. So direct air capture might not be something that you automatically connect to going to go vote, but thinking about creatively about the way that we can use the technology, the companies, to benefit the communities that they're in a way that can change the systems that have led to the oppression of these people is the creativity that I really like to see.
Oh, well, I'm very much enjoying that story and the possibilities that are out there. I can see that some of the questions are already coming in online, and I want to get to them. But I did want to talk about education, and I guess we've also been circling around this conversation as well throughout this about the lack of communication, about the lack of people understanding what direct air capture is. They relate far more to trees than they do to a great big metal plant. What needs to be done? What education needs to be out there to close this gap? Ugbaad.
Yes, so I will shamelessly plug that at Carbon 180, we work directly with EJ organizations to do this exact thing, which is education. So we have 3 EJ environmental justice organizations that are based in different parts across the United States, and they were very apprehensive, if not skeptical, if not outright opposed to carbon removal when we initially reached out to them. But the thing about them was that they were very open to learning and they were very open to having a conversation. And we spent the past year with them just going through Carbon Removal 101, not only talking about the great benefits of DAC, but we talked about the limitations of all these different pathways. We talked about the risks. We talked about the unknowns that's out there. We talked through the communications narrative, what's happening in reporting, what's happening on the Hill and with policymakers and legislation, and how do all of these different pieces intersect with what's happening in their community or what could happen in their community. And I'm not going to say, I know Aaron mentioned earlier, they're not necessarily going to go out and protest for carbon removal, but they're far more open to the idea, and they're taking the information we gave and bringing it back to the communities that trust them, and they're that first source of information. And that's sort of that organic sort of education that we're wanting to hopefully inspire and really create this sort of self-sustaining grassroots movement for carbon removal, where it's not technocratic, it's not top-down, but it's really for the people, by the people, and we're just there as resources for education and to answer questions and to honestly rethink our assumptions in the way that we work as well.
I mean, one of the questions that's come in online is, what is the role of education in community engagement? And I guess you have really kind of outlined it, but maybe I put it to you that, is it that we have to go one step further? It's not just education, you said it yourself, it's transparency.
Yeah, so oftentimes when I tell people I work for the National Wildlife Federation, I kind of get a look like, what are you doing in this room? Or I get fear like, you're gonna protest and shut us down. But the National Wildlife Federation has a climate and energy policy program, and that's where I'm housed as an industrial policy specialist. The Federation also has 52 chapters across the US and its territories. So the chapters are completely autonomous, they're really focused on what's happening in their state. And one of the ways that we talk to them is, NWF is a historic conservation organization. We've been around for over 100 years. And the conservation that you are typically used to is exactly what CDR is. It's just a natural version of that. So I think really meeting people where they're at in terms of what is important to them, what is familiar, like Ugbaad said, to them, and then using that as a platform to then say, okay, you people that do conservation are very well versed in the benefits of carbon dioxide removal. So now let's take it another step further and maybe introduce some concepts that you aren't familiar with, like technological removal. And I think, we have a very broad constituency. I was joking earlier today that we're one of the organizations that has, a public constituency. So we're in your inbox saying, the whales are dying, climate is changing, can you please give us $10, sort of thing. And we reach people by talking about what is important to them and what they care about. Maybe that is a particular type of animal. We have a big hunting and fishing constituency. So we reach out to them and say, in this particular region, people, the hunting restrictions were changed around this particular species of deer, and hunters were upset about it. Do you know why it changed? It had to do with habitat loss. It had to do with species loss, and all of those things are connected back to climate. So I think public education, much like the engagement, is sort of a two-way street where you're not talking at people because, once again, using an education analogy, how many of us listen when our teachers talked at us versus it being a conversation moving back and forth? And so I think public education has to be viewed in the same way. It's a very kind of situational and local way of communicating ideas.
Okay, let me open the floor then to questions. We've had a couple online already. Does anybody here in the room have a question for our panel now on environmental justice?
I think there's one.
Please don't be shy. Oh, thank you.
My name is Jaleet Khawaja. I've got a question, actually a request. So companies want to have social impact, right? They talk endlessly about it in their sustainability reports. What are your top 3 pieces of advice for corporates to use their social impact programs to contribute towards environmental justice?
Sure, I'm happy to hop in. The first thing that comes to mind for me is a lot of these companies hire big consulting firms to do research or to do analysis or to come up with their recommendations. Hire someone local, hire a small community-based organization, hire someone from a disadvantaged community who knows the work that they're doing, who can bring that different lens, who can be very upfront and honest about what you are and are not doing and how it's impacting their day-to-day lives. I think that's the first piece that I would do. Similar to in that vein, but not just having external hiring, but internal hiring practices I think are incredibly important. If you are hiring the same type of person, which I will call out is usually older white men, you're gonna have the same perspective on everything that you do and how you operate. When you really branch out and think about diversity, it's not just a fun thing that's happening right now that's in diversity, equity, and inclusion. It genuinely does bring diversity of thought into the conversation. It brings lived experiences.
And people want to be seen by you want to feel seen by the corporations that
Absolutely.
are in your communities. I want to know that there are people who look like me, who come from where I come from, because then I feel as though I'm being represented in that organization. Sorry to...
No, that was perfect. As Simone said, I think you're also going to have that trust as well. If you have someone that looks like you, that came from similar background as you, who's operating in this space, that message just lands differently than someone who, honestly, the only reason why you're interacting is because of this one conference or this one conversation. So I genuinely think those 2 pieces alone are big things to chew off of for any sort of company to think of.
I would add to that, going back to the point about the voting that I mentioned, I would think big. I would think about the way that we can affect systemic change through the way that we are using our sustainability goals and our engagement goals and community goals. I think that oftentimes we're too siloed in our area of expertise and deploying what we think is correct. And so I think, trying to create systemic change that is going to lead to that inclusive future that I was talking about is a really big way of thinking. And I would also just say that coming back to goal setting is looking at stuff that is measurable, the metrics as you're growing as a company, as you're advancing, to be able to look back and say, this is where we've come from. And so we're able to create a plan for the future. I think people want transparency, and when you're able to put markers in different aspects of your growth, that is a really easy way to start being transparent with people.
Thank you.
I'll add one more angle on this. I mean, if we're talking about in the context of buying carbon removal, I think there's a huge opportunity for corporations to say that this matters to them in their buying decisions. So I think, and we've been talking about the responsibility a lot so far around what the startups have on them to be responsible for in their deployments of projects. But there is also a responsibility, I would argue, on the funder side, the investor, philanthropic, buying, anybody who's making those decisions and putting money into the space. Make this one of your layers of consideration, your screening criteria. Or if you're not doing that directly, work with a partner who does.
Great. Any other questions in the room? Yes, please. Thank you very much.
Oras Tynkkynen, Finnish Parliament. The environmental justice discussion is, of course, very advanced in the US. Now we are in Europe, and Climeworks has facilities in Switzerland and Iceland. And I'm not to overplay the differences between these countries and the US, but let's just say that they are quite different societies. I just wonder if you have any ideas or perspectives on how the environmental justice discussion would be different in different contexts and different countries like Switzerland and Iceland, for example.
Absolutely. I think very different, which is why I prefaced by saying that I was coming from a US-centric sort of perspective. But I think the reason why I brought up climate justice and that global piece is that our economies are also connected around the world. And what you do in one place is going to impact someone else's livelihood somewhere else. So somewhere like Switzerland, or thinking about Climeworks specifically, they're not operating just in Switzerland, right? They're operating in other parts around the world. There's supply chain considerations, there's long-term impact considerations, there's the greater good conversation that we're thinking about. And so even though you are in Europe and the term environmental justice may mean something very different here, it may not have any meaning here depending on who you speak to, but there are still global justice considerations that need to be included in the decision making that you have. I would also argue that it may not be the traditional environmental justice in the way that we're talking about it, but there are still people who are less advantaged. I don't know what the term would be here. Marginalized. There are different backgrounds. There's still some elements of what we're talking about that would hold true. I think it would be a little bit different, but I would still branch out to think about that global context in particular here.
I think it also goes back to setting standards as a whole. I think environmental justice means something differently, and as Nikki kind of prefaced at the beginning, that in America it comes from a very civil rights heavy context. There's a lot of historical kind of policy and legislation that led to where the environmental justice movement is today. So I encourage all countries who are interested in participating and thinking about how the history of their politics and legislation has led to marginalization of certain kinds of people. Because as far as I know, no society is perfect. And so I think that even though some may be more advanced, or the marginalized groups or disenfranchised groups may look a little bit different, there are still people who are going to be impacted. And maybe there are ways to also highlight how certain countries have met environmental justice criteria, to say that because we know people here care about this particular thing, this is how we're meeting those needs that they care about in the work that we're doing. It may not look like brown people living close to a toxic waste facility is an example we use very frequently in the United States, but how are you meeting a community's needs that they ask to be addressed, and how are you connecting that to giving them a more healthy and sustainable environment? That itself is environmental justice. So I think, just as Ugbaad said, there's many contexts in which to think of it.
Sorry, something else just came and I
Go ahead.
Okay. I also think what's really important is, especially with like Climeworks, for example, it may be the first introduction of direct air capture to people around the world. And so the way in which they deploy and the considerations that they take is going to impact the impression of maybe what happens in the US and what happens in Kenya. I know that was brought up earlier. So there's also that responsibility of understanding we're really at the start of something huge. How are we going to take that responsibility, and how are you going to think about that public perception that's going to shape what's going to look like in 10 years? So it may not be environmental justice in the traditional sense, but consent-based siting is something that is still fundamentally felt across the world and should be considered. Community engagement, it may not look the way that we are describing it in the US, but you still need to do community engagement for the project that you're doing anywhere in the world. And thinking about, like I said, the global perspective, if you're planning on outsourcing any sort of work, if you're planning on having sites that are international, there's a power dynamic there as well, and there's political dynamics there too. So really just being creative about how you're thinking about the fundamental principles that we're talking about and how it applies in your context is a little bit of homework maybe, but I think something that's really important to think about for the future of not just the work that you're doing at your company, but honestly the entire industry that we're talking about.
Well, I've found this conversation absolutely fascinating, so thank you very much indeed for joining us. Please take another seat in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you.